Well, we have seen Saw, Wrong Turn, which is much more violent and has a little bit of story around such elements. If you like The Boys, this comes to the brains of the writer Garth Ennis, Crost. Well, this most savage and brutal version of all his stories, and this will be made as a movie in 2025. If you are new here, join hands with the Notorious. Welcome to the world of most savage stories of all time, Crost. Click on the link above to watch Crost Part 1, and the rest of the story continues here. From his view, Stan sees what else is in the bowl. Bullets. As soon as he says bullets, Cindy grabs a gun, stands up, and quickly walks toward the camp. At the camp, Scott enters Randall's tent to clean his wound. Randall is lying on his side, his injured shoulder exposed. Scott gently tells him he needs to turn him onto his back to clean the wound. But when Scott does, it's already too late. Randall is fully infected, with the rash spread across his face. Before Scott can call for help, Randall opens his eyes and attacks him. Outside, the campers hear Scott's screams. Kelly is the closest to the tent. Thomas calls for her as she tries to understand the chaos. Before Thomas can move, Randall steps out of the tent, his face covered in blood. He charges at Kelly, trying to grab her while she frantically backs away. The other campers fire at Randall, and one bullet hits him in the hip, but he doesn't slow down. Kelly runs into the woods, crashing through branches as Randall, grinning madly, chases her. Thomas follows, trying to get ahead so Kelly can reach him. Just as Randall is about to grab Kelly, Cindy steps from behind a tree and shoots him in the face. Bang! It's finally over, but the gunfire has alerted other infected nearby, and they need to leave fast. Stan holds Patrick tightly, keeping him from seeing the horror. The campers grab their things and move through the forest. As they walk, Stan and Cindy talk about how the infected are learning new ways to turn others. Bullets may be slower than bites, but they still work. Randall was proof of that. Stan thinks the infected are getting smarter, but Cindy disagrees. There are countless ways to be cruel, and this was just one of them. Cindy looks down, her emotions finally breaking through. She pauses, then tells Stan, "When we stop tonight, we should talk about Alaska." Stan nods and gets lost in thought. He wonders how much he and the others have changed since the world fell apart. They have to be ready to kill at any moment, even if it means killing someone they once cared about. None of them stop to think about what it's doing to them, what they're turning into. Would they become no different from the monsters they fight? Things are getting worse for the group. While traveling through an abandoned town, they get cornered by infected. They manage to hide, but the creatures are too close. Cindy, Patrick, and Stan crouch behind wrecked cars as the infected search the streets. Stan stands nervously, his body trembling uncontrollably as he finds himself uncomfortably close to the cross. Closer than he's ever been before disaster struck. The proximity makes his heart race with an intensity. Cindy signals him to stay quiet with a finger to her lips, her eyes radiating an icy coldness that leaves no room for argument. Stan instantly comprehends that he needs to master his emotions and maintain absolute silence. The scene widens dramatically to reveal their companions taking shelter behind an overturned bus, their weapons held ready for any potential threat. Thomas cradles Kelly protectively with one arm while maintaining a firm grip on his pistol with the other. In stark contrast to Kittrick, who maintains laser-like focus on tracking every movement and sound of the nearby cross, Thomas can barely contain his terror, his lips moving in silent prayer for their nightmare to end. The cross has now advanced terrifyingly close to Stan's hiding position behind the car, barely maintaining a foot or two of separation. Stan feels sweat pouring down his face as panic threatens to overwhelm him. He squeezes his eyes shut and holds his breath, desperately willing himself to remain undetected. After what seems like an endless stretch of time, the immediate danger finally passes. When Cindy finally signals that the Cross is departing, Stan allows himself to breathe again, opening his eyes cautiously. She analyzes their movement patterns and explains to Stan that based on their systematic search behavior, they're likely pursuing another survivor who either remains hidden in the vicinity or passed through the area recently. The group watches intently as the Cross continue their methodical search while gradually moving away from their position. Once they're able to regroup safely, they carefully assess their surroundings and current situation. Stan reflects internally that their standard protocol after such close encounters typically involves a 2-hour waiting period before proceeding. However, this particular situation demands extra caution, and they unanimously agree to extend their wait to 4 hours. During their extended hideout, approximately 30 minutes after the Cross passed their position, the silence is shattered by a dozen gunshots, followed by an unsettling quiet that sets them all on edge. This strikes them as highly unusual, since encounters with the Cross typically involve extended periods of screaming that can last for hours. Instead, they hear the distinctive sound of an engine starting up and gradually fading into the distance, which prompts them to add those crucial extra 2 hours to their waiting time. As the situation stabilizes, Thomas and 2 other group members cautiously explore a ransacked grocery store in search of any remaining supplies, only to find it completely stripped bare by previous survivors. One of the group members, an unnamed blond man in his 30s, spots a solitary can of food lying conspicuously in the street. Despite Jeff's frantic warnings to maintain cover, the man's desperation overrides his caution. As he bends down to retrieve what appears to be a can of beans, his foot suddenly becomes ensnared in a hidden bear trap. His agonized scream pierces the air, but is abruptly cut short as an arrow whistles through the air and embeds itself directly in his back, killing him instantly. While the group struggles to process this shocking turn of events, Cindy's trained eye quickly identifies the attacker's position. She alerts everyone to focus their attention on the roof's top left corner, and Kittrick responds immediately, firing his weapon in the indicated direction. A lone figure wielding a crossbow stands exposed atop the building, and both Stan and Cindy open fire without hesitation. Stan's internal monologue reveals his dawning horror as he realizes their actions were devastatingly hasty. Their bullets find their mark in the figure's back, and as it plummets to its death, they make the horrifying discovery that their target was a human woman. Cindy, maintaining her focus on group security, rapidly issues orders for Kittrick and Jeff to scout the rooftops while preparing the others for immediate evacuation. The situation suddenly explodes into chaos as 6 8-year-old children emerge from the shadows, their terrified screams begging for a ceasefire filling the air. Cindy, Thomas, and Kittrick watch in stunned silence as Stan raises his hands in surrender, positioning himself as a human shield between his group and the children. When Cindy demands an explanation for his actions, Stan's voice rises to a desperate shout as he declares that these aren't Cross, they're human children who need their protection. The wounded woman lying on the ground, her back riddled with bullet wounds and her face horrifically injured from the 5-story fall, manages to find the strength to plead for the children's safety. The children maintain their aggressive stance, screaming demands for the group to stay away from the injured woman. In a weak voice, the woman introduces herself as Ann Cook, revealing her former role as their kindergarten teacher before the apocalypse transformed their world. She explains that after months of chaos and destruction, she remains their only protector and guardian in this horrific new reality. Stan and Cindy's expressions reflect their growing horror as they fully grasp the tragic consequences of their impulsive actions. Anne attempts to direct them to a nearby location containing medical supplies, but Stan interrupts her, demanding to know why she shot their trapped companion. Meanwhile, Cindy checks in with Kittrick, who reports from his elevated position that no Cross are visible within their immediate vicinity. Anne, still bleeding profusely on the ground, explains through labored breaths that she killed their companion to silence his screams and prevent drawing unwanted attention to their location. She then reveals their desperate survival strategy, setting traps and targeting humans rather than Cross, using food as bait to lure in potential victims. She explains that feeding 6 growing children in these harsh conditions presents an impossible challenge, though she hadn't anticipated encountering such a large, well-armed group, usually targeting smaller parties or solitary travelers. Stan expresses his anguish, stating that they would have willingly shared their supplies if approached. But Cindy's mind races as she pieces together the horrifying implications of Anne's confession. They weren't stopping survivors to collect their supplies. The survivors themselves were the intended food source. The terrible realization dawns that Anne and these 6 children had become cannibals to survive. As night falls, the group establishes a secure position under a bridge in an abandoned waterway. Thomas maintains watch outside while eavesdropping on the intense conversation between Cindy and Anne, whom they've surprisingly taken in along with her young charges. Cindy directly confronts Anne about their cannibalistic practices, which she admits to without reservation, including the disturbing detail that she taught the children hunting and trapping techniques. Her every confession ends with desperate pleas for the children's safety, and while Cindy offers verbal reassurance, her voice carries an undertone of uncertainty that suggests a different fate may await them. 4 of the children have succumbed to exhaustion and sleep nearby, while 2 boys, one blonde, one dark-haired, remain awake, engaged in quiet conversation. Anne, detecting Cindy's barely concealed revulsion, launches into a desperate explanation of their circumstances. A week without food forced them to make unthinkable choices. Her voice breaks as she questions what alternatives exist for protecting these innocent children. Cindy responds with characteristic bluntness, stating that while she can't provide the right answer, turning to cannibalism and corrupting young children's minds certainly wasn't it. In a separate conversation, Stan consults with Jeff, who has become their default medical specialist since Scott's death, about Anne's condition. Jeff honestly admits his limitations in properly assessing her severe injuries or predicting her chances of survival through the night. Anne continues sharing her harrowing story with Cindy, describing how the apocalypse began during a normal school day. Teachers evacuated with small groups of students, but as weeks turned into months, their food supplies diminished, and she watched helplessly as the children grew increasingly malnourished. With Crost patrolling everywhere, attempting to search for food in public spaces became equivalent to suicide. She recounts how 3 large groups of survivors passed through their area without sharing even minimal supplies, and then winter arrived, bringing with it a lone survivor who threatened Anne's life. She explains how she shot him in self-defense, but upon finding no food on his person and facing the harsh reality of approaching winter, they made their first devastating choice to consume human flesh. Despite her tear-filled explanation and obvious remorse, Cindy remains unmoved, condemning their choice to continue hunting survivors like the Crosts themselves. Anne makes a final attempt to justify their actions, explaining the impossibility of traveling between cities with 6 young children, particularly given their limited weapons, just a crossbow with a handful of reusable bolts. However, Cindy's attention has shifted to the children, particularly the 2 awake boys, while she contemplates the difficult decisions that lie ahead. Anne, recognizing the dangerous direction of Cindy's thoughts, desperately clutches her hand, begging her not to hold the children responsible for their survival choices. As Cindy continues to strategize their next moves, she observes the two boys watching her intently, while young Patrick remains innocently absorbed in playing with his toy car, unaware of the fate being decided for him and his companions. The group's intentions become crystal clear when Cindy suddenly calls Patrick over, deliberately separating him from the other children. Stan observes this with a mixture of reluctance and approval, understanding that while isolating these children seems harsh, keeping Patrick away from them is absolutely necessary. This moment triggers Stan's memories of their encounter with Officer Thomas, a law enforcement officer whose grip on sanity had been eroded by his obsessive need to maintain order in their chaotic world. Stan recalls how the group had been traveling when they encountered a horrific scene: hordes of the Crost brutalizing and massacring people along a highway. This occurred barely a month after Cindy had made the decision to abandon their pickup truck. The victims they witnessed had likely managed to survive until then by concealing themselves in vehicles or simply driving away, but now found themselves trapped on the congested highway with no escape route. Cindy, Stan, and Thomas watch in horror as the highway transforms into a scene of unprecedented carnage. Throughout this nightmare, Patrick remains in the background, seemingly absorbed in his toys, while Kelly sits with her back deliberately turned away from the highway. Even without her sight, the sounds alone are more than she can bear to witness. Stan grimly acknowledges that Cindy's earlier decision to abandon their vehicle had been prescient, earning a simple nod from her. Their subsequent discussion centers on the urgent need to evacuate the area, recognizing that the massive number of bite victims will soon transform into Cross, creating an even greater threat than they're currently equipped to handle. Thomas briefly steps away to check on Kelly, offering her water and support, but encounters her in an unusually bitter mood. She sharply declines his offer, emphasizing her blindness with barely contained frustration before immediately regretting her harsh tone and apologizing. Thomas, understanding her struggles, attempts to comfort her by suggesting her blindness might be temporary. This gentle gesture prompts Kelly to open up, asking Thomas to promise to look after her. She acknowledges her recent difficult behavior, her dependence on him since their encounter at the diner, and the fact that they're still relative strangers despite his unwavering support. She expresses self-loathing and frustration at having to make such a request, but recognizes that, in their apocalyptic reality, blindness essentially guarantees death without someone like Thomas for protection. While Thomas's verbal response remains unheard as the scene shifts to Stan and Cindy's conversation, his expression communicates his answer more effectively than words ever could. Meanwhile, Stan and Cindy engage in their own meaningful exchange, with Stan expressing gratitude for her rescue of their group from a Crosswoman's attack. He emphasizes that her survival instincts had kept them alive even after the initial rescue. Cindy responds matter-of-factly, explaining that her process is straightforward. She thinks, decides, and acts. However, she stresses that the crucial element is what follows those actions: the necessity to move forward without dwelling on past decisions or their consequences, as excessive reflection can leave one vulnerable to ambush and failure. Following this profound statement, Cindy awkwardly coughs and returns her attention to studying a map, dismissing Stan's thanks while using her rare nickname for him, Slick, bringing a slow smile to his face. Simultaneously, Thomas and Kelly have reconciled, their hands intertwined as Thomas reaffirms his commitment to protect her. Their moment is abruptly interrupted by a commanding male voice ordering them to freeze, accompanied by the threatening presence of a shotgun. The entire group, Cindy, Stan, Thomas, and Kelly, are caught off guard, with Cindy's immediate reaction being to shield Patrick. The armed man identifies himself as a police officer, also named Thomas, distinguished as Officer Thomas in the narrative. He notices Cindy eyeing her rifle and demands they surrender all weapons, explaining that his experiences since the apocalypse have left him unable to trust anyone, even fellow survivors. After collecting their weapons, he directs them toward his police cruiser parked behind the hill, instructing Cindy to carry Patrick while Thomas assists Kelly. As they navigate through the woods toward Officer Thomas's vehicle, they discover other survivors who would eventually become part of their group, apparently captured earlier by the officer. Stan quietly inquires about Cindy's concealed pistol, unknown to Officer Thomas, and she reveals she's waiting to assess the situation before taking any action. Jeff warmly greets Stan and Cindy, but Thomas interrupts, demanding to know Officer Thomas's intentions. The officer responds with a delusional speech about restoring order and reorganizing surviving citizens. Cindy immediately recognizes his mental instability and stops listening, instead surveying their surroundings. Her attention fixes on a cross confined in the cruiser's back seat, apparently a prisoner who transformed while in custody. When questioned, Officer Thomas proudly explains that the prisoner was arrested for DUI on the day everything began, and regardless of his transformation, he remains under arrest. While Jeff shows sympathy for the officer's position, Cindy's concern visibly intensifies. Stan's reminiscence ends, bringing him back to the present night in the abandoned waterway. Kittrick stands guard, maintaining a stoic expression despite the tears streaming down his face as he listens to the group's discussion inside. They're debating the fate of Cook's children, now orphaned after her death the previous night. Cindy advocates for ending their lives, arguing that their conditioning and the group's limited resources make them a dangerous liability. She emphasizes that future encounters with the Cross are inevitable, and these children would likely face unspeakable horrors before eventual death or transformation. Stan maintains his distance as Cindy presents her case to the others. While Thomas and Kelly oppose the decision, they recognize their limited influence. Jeff, after covering Anne's body and collecting their medical supplies, attempts to defend her actions as survival-driven. But Cindy challenges this perspective. She suggests Anne's story might have been fabricated after being caught, pointing out that a smaller or solitary group might have met a different fate, becoming mere sustenance without explanation. Cindy's argument sways Kelly, who acknowledges that abandoning the children would only lead to their death, transformation, or continuation of cannibalistic practices. Despite protests from Jeff and Thomas, Cindy delivers her final, non-negotiable argument. She refuses to expose Patrick to these children. The group begins packing up, leaving Stan and Cindy behind to finish gathering their supplies. Later, Cindy stands alone in the darkened tunnel with the sleeping children, while Stan waits outside with Patrick. Suddenly struck by realization, Stan rushes into the tunnel as Cindy begins carrying out their grim decision. Two children fall before the others can fully wake, their eyes widening in horror as they comprehend their fate. Stan joins Cindy, and together they methodically continue their terrible task. Finally, only the two self-proclaimed leader boys remain, their tears doing nothing to stay the inevitable. 6 more shots ring out, and silence descends, broken only by Cindy's quiet thanks to Stan for sharing this burden with her. The group is traveling north and has taken shelter in an abandoned apartment building. Cindy and Stan are discussing their next move, while Patrick sleeps on the sofa beside Cindy. Stan wants to stop in Denver for supplies before crossing the mountains, but Cindy refuses. She thinks big cities are too dangerous, and she already hates their current hiding spot. They are trapped inside with only one way out, the stairs, which could easily be blocked if the infected, called the Crost, find them. The rest of the group is in the other room. Cindy and Stan realize they aren't exactly welcome. After all, they recently killed 6 children in cold blood. But in their minds, they had no choice. Those kids had turned into cannibals and wouldn't have survived anyway. In the other room, the rest of the group avoids eye contact with Cindy and Stan. Crick is keeping watch, Jeff is asleep, and Thomas, Kelly, and Sheena sit together, ignoring them. Stan knows no excuse will ever change what they did. He remembers it all in a painful flashback. Cindy tries to stay calm by stroking Patrick, while Stan understands her pain. Patrick has turned out to be a good kid. Stan senses Cindy wants to be alone, so he takes over Crick's watch. Crick nods and walks away. Alone, Stan starts thinking about what happened earlier. That morning, he and Cindy had been keeping watch when they saw a terrifying sight. A group of Crost working together. That was when he started wondering, are they evolving? Now, the story introduces the recurring villain, Horse. Why is he called Horse? Well, because of a very specific large feature he wields as a weapon. The scene opens with Horse hitting another Crost across the face with it. Cindy and Stan are watching from a rooftop. Stan is shocked by Horse's size, but Cindy is more interested in what just happened. It looked like Horse was punishing one of his own. Was this some kind of leadership? Were the Crost developing a hierarchy? The problem is, Horse and his group are standing between Cindy, Stan, and the only bridge out of town. Even worse, these Crost seem different. First, they are keeping prisoners alive. The captives are beaten and cut, but none have been turned, and their clothes are still on. Either these Crost are controlling their urges, or they have a worse plan in mind. Cindy realizes they have no choice but to fight their way through. Stan tries to lighten the mood by pointing out that the Crost don't have guns. But just as he says that, two more Crost appear. One is an old man wearing just a loincloth. The other is a limbless, blind man called Stump. Why Stump? Well, he has no arms or legs. Simple enough. The old man is holding a shotgun and demands to see what Horse and his crew are planning with their prisoners. Horse refuses. The old man and Stump scream in rage, but they back down and return to their watch. Then Cindy and Stan see what Horse's group is really up to. They've gathered a mix of infected and uninfected people and thrown them into a dumpster. A bucket of knives is tossed in, and it becomes clear they are forcing the survivors to fight to the death. Cindy was right. This is just another sick game created by the Crost. Stan is disturbed. The idea of the Crost organizing and controlling themselves chills him. Cindy doesn't like it either. They quickly leave the rooftop. As they go, Stan can't stop thinking about Horse's group and the disturbing realization that the Crost might be changing. It reminds him of Officer Thomas and an event from the past that first made him suspect this evolution. The flashback continues. Officer Thomas had once locked up a Crost prisoner in his police cruiser. The prisoner taunted him, laughing and saying horrible things about Thomas's wife. Cindy had no patience for this and demanded to know why the officer was keeping the creature alive. Thomas's face darkened. The prisoner claimed to know what happened to his wife, what they did to her before and after turning her. Meanwhile, back with the group, they were arguing about how to escape the city. This was back when Joel and Amy were still alive. Stan asked if the prisoner had given them any useful information, but Jeff said no one dared get close. Only Officer Thomas had been brave, or foolish, enough to keep it alive by giving it water. Patrick then tugged at Stan's sleeve, wanting to ask something. Back at the police car, Officer Thomas was getting lost in his thoughts, recounting what the prisoner had said about his wife. Cindy, frustrated, tried to snap him out of it. She told him the prisoner was messing with his mind. The creature didn't even know his wife's name. It had only guessed he was married by the ring on his finger. At the same time, Amy kept telling the group that someone named Arn hadn't eaten in days, but no one listened, not even Joel. Meanwhile, Patrick was offering his yogurt to Arn, showing his kindness. Then, back at the cruiser, everything spiraled out of control. Officer Thomas snapped and screamed, refusing to listen to Cindy. She wanted him to kill the prisoner, but Thomas insisted on following the law. They don't execute prisoners, even infected ones. Cindy tried to reason with him, but it was clear he was breaking. Thomas reached for his gun, and that's when the Crost prisoner made his move. The prisoner spat directly into Officer Thomas's eye. It was over. He was infected. Enraged, Thomas shot the prisoner in the head. Cindy tried to calm him, but as soon as he heard her voice, he aimed his gun at her and fired. She barely dodged in time. Thomas was momentarily blinded by the spit in his eyes, giving Cindy a chance to think. Officer Thomas kept shooting wildly, ordering everyone to stay down and away from their weapons, which he had taken earlier. As he reloaded, Cindy took no chances. She shot the Crost prisoner again to make sure it was dead. The group hit the ground, avoiding Thomas's gunfire. Cindy crept toward him, but it was too late. He turned, and his face twisted into the same sick grin as the Crost. He had turned. But Cindy didn't hesitate. Before Thomas could move, she shot him twice in the head. Everyone was in shock. Another group member looked horrified as Cindy gave Stan a direct order. Check the cars for any supplies or weapons they could use on their journey. As the sun rises over the abandoned apartment building, Stan snaps out of his thoughts. His mind had been stuck in the past, remembering Officer Thomas and the things they had all been through. But now he focuses on the present. Their group is hiding here for now, but they can't stay much longer. Stan thinks about Sheena's past. Before joining them, she had been part of a survival group made up of police officers and firefighters. But over time, things fell apart. They lost control and lost their minds. She was the only one who made it out alive. Her old group had once captured a Crost and tortured it, hoping to get answers. But there were no answers to be found. Stan gives up his lookout duty, letting Thomas take over. He sits with the others and tells them about Horsecock and his crew, the dangerous Crost group they had seen the day before. The group debates if the Crost are evolving. Some think it's just a rare case, but Sheena reminds them that the Crost have learned things before. Kelly then suggests something chilling. What if the Crost are just like people? Some are wild and impulsive, while others are smart and organized. What if they aren't changing but have always been this way? The group starts overthinking, getting more scared. Cindy interrupts them, saying this isn't helping. There's no rule book for survival. Thomas, frustrated, asks if Cindy has a real plan. She does. They will cross the bridge at midnight under the cover of darkness. She doesn't wait for Thomas's approval and simply stares him down. Hours later, the group reaches the bridge unnoticed, but they face a problem. A large section is destroyed. Only a single metal beam stretches across. It's the only way. They have no choice. Thomas goes first. The beam wobbles, but he makes it across safely. Meanwhile, at their camp, Horsecock and his crew are feasting on human flesh from their cruel game. Then, Stump suddenly tilts his head, sensing something. Though blind and limbless, his hearing is sharp. He lets out a loud, eerie scream, alerting the others. Sheena, who is still on the near side of the bridge, hears the scream. She looks up and sees Horsecock's crew charging toward them. Stan and Cindy take aim, ready to fight. But Jeff and Kelly are still crossing the beam, and Kelly is frozen in fear. Jeff urges her forward, but she panics. Sheena yells at her, but Kelly won't move. Thomas tries to calm her. His voice reaches her, and she finally starts moving again. But Horsecock's crew is getting closer. Cindy and Stan open fire. Jeff makes it across, and Kelly is almost there. Sheena screams at her to jump. Kelly leaps and lands safely, but the impact shakes the beam. The loose end shifts, making it even more unstable. Cindy orders Stan to keep the Crost at a distance while Sheena attempts to cross. But as she steps onto the beam, her weight causes it to break. She's left hanging onto the broken edge of the bridge, dangling over the void. The group watches in horror, but there's no time to grieve. Horsecock's crew is seconds away, guns in hand. Cindy yells for the group to take cover. Sheena struggles to pull herself up but stops when she sees the Crost getting closer. Cindy knows what she's thinking and offers to shoot her before they can get to her. But Sheena shakes her head. She closes her eyes and lets go, choosing to fall to her death rather than be taken by the Crost. Stan watches, his eyes wet with sorrow. Cindy and Stan don't have time to mourn. They turn and run as Horsecock's crew screams after them. The Crost recognize them, calling Cindy the one with the brat and Stan the clown. Hearing these names terrifies them, but they don't stop. They keep running, leaving Horsecock and his crew raging on the other side of the bridge. Well, that's an intense face-off. This issue is more subdued, focusing on the developing relationships within the group and how far they've come since their first meeting, largely thanks to Officer Thomas. While it doesn't move the main plot forward much, it offers important moments of growth and reflection. The group has finally reached the Rockies, and winter has set in. They're equipped with the proper gear to survive the brutal cold, and there are no signs of the Crost for miles. The fresh mountain air and the calm sense of safety help ease their fears, at least for now. However, there are internal struggles within the group, particularly with Jeff and Kittrick. Jeff is sick and has a weakened immune system, making it difficult for him to handle the harsh temperatures. Kittrick has lost his will to live, something that has been haunting him since he joined the group. The group discusses the state of the world, recalling how the government managed to shut down nuclear power plants before the disaster fully took over. They also note how other nations had shown restraint, with no nukes fired except for Israel, where every nuke went off, annihilating the entire Middle East. Stan tries to bond with Cindy by pointing out how she's cold and distant with Patrick, while secretly soft underneath. Cindy gives him a chance to understand her better, but soon returns to her icy demeanor. She warns him that if she ever stops being this way, she and Patrick won't survive. This causes Stan to reflect on their past, particularly the day they lost Officer Thomas. Despite the loss, the group remained intact, forming tight relationships and clear roles. Cindy had been blunt from the start: follow her lead or leave. He remembers how Thomas and he had grown close since the diner, and how Thomas had shared with him that he was gay. It never affected their bond, something Stan valued deeply. The group also had their first real conversation about the Crost then, each person offering their own theories. Some believed it was divine intervention, others thought it was a corporate experiment, and some saw it as a natural occurrence. Stan now realizes how much closer he's become to Kelly and Thomas, how they've grown comfortable joking and teasing each other to make the apocalyptic world a little more bearable. That night, as they travel, Stan gets to share a quiet moment with Cindy and Patrick, lying under the stars and watching a pack of wolves. Cindy confides that this is the first peaceful moment she's had with Patrick in a long time, admitting that the constant running made it impossible to have such moments before. She reflects that, while the apocalypse has torn their world apart, it has allowed them to experience these small but important moments they might have never had otherwise. This issue starts with a striking first panel. A single-page image of a terrified horse galloping through the forest, its body covered in deep cuts. A long chain dangles from the saddle, and at the end of it swings a severed human leg. Cindy and the group lie flat in the bushes, hiding, watching whatever is chasing the horse. Among them is Brett, a new addition to their group. He's in his early 30s, loud and annoying, but they tolerate him because he has valuable food and medical supplies. As soon as the horse vanishes from sight, Brett whispers that they should make a run for it. Cindy immediately shuts him up, and a second later he sees why. A large group of the Crost follows the bloody trail left by the horse. They move together in a pack, armed with knives and guns. One Crost man lags behind, gripping a baseball bat. He doesn't seem to be part of their crew, which becomes obvious when the others stop and glare at him. Their leader steps forward and, without hesitation, swings his machete, slicing off a piece of the man's skull. The wounded Crost stumbles, his brain partly exposed, but instead of screaming in pain, he laughs. As he falls to the ground, he lands just inches from Stan, who freezes in horror. Stan grips his gun, ready to shoot, but Cindy grabs his hands and whispers desperately for him to hold back. If he fires, they're all dead. The Crost man, still bleeding out, keeps chuckling for a few more moments before the life drains from his body. The group remains motionless, waiting. They stay put for an hour before Cindy finally gives the order to move. Brett, being Brett, wastes no time teasing Stan about how close he came to death. Stan glares at him, but doesn't take the bait. They need Brett for now, so fighting him isn't worth it. Instead, he keeps packing, while Brett, laughing to himself, nudges the dead Crost with his boot, treating it like some kind of joke. As they walk, Stan's thoughts drift to Jeff and Kittrick. Both of them survived the brutal winter, but only because they had each other. Once Jeff got better, he took care of Kittrick, feeding him, helping him stand, doing whatever he could to keep him going as Kittrick slowly lost the will to live. The group moves in silence, except for Brett, who just can't keep his mouth shut. This time, he has a problem with Kittrick. That guy's the most miserable person I've ever seen. Yeah, I get it. The world sucks now, but come on, get over it. How is moping around helping any of us? He glares at the others, itching for a fight, but no one gives him a reaction. Cindy, Stan, and the rest ignore him completely, treating him like an annoying stray dog barking for attention. Then we finally see what's been weighing Kittrick down all this time: his past. Before everything fell apart, he had been on vacation with his family. He was out swimming in the ocean when the Crost attacked the beach. He was too far away to stop what happened next. He watched helplessly as they decapitated his wife. Then, more of them arrived, hacking his son and daughter into pieces. Desperate to reach the shore, Kittrick swam as fast as he could, only to see a Crost police officer pull out a gun and start shooting at him. With no choice, Kittrick dove underwater and escaped. But the horror wasn't over. As he swam, something heavy splashed onto his back, sending ripples through the water. When he turned to see what it was, his heart sank. It was his wife's severed head. Stan remembers the first time Kittrick told them this story. He had spoken so quickly, like he was desperate to get it out, as if letting the words escape would kill the broken version of himself. And the next morning, it did. When Kittrick woke up, the man they had met was gone. In his place was the silent, empty shell of the person who now walks beside them. By now, the group has found an empty house to rest in for the night. Cindy, Stan, Brett, and Jeff sit together, discussing their next move as they get closer to the Canadian border. Patrick sleeps soundly in Kelly's lap, while Kittrick sits quietly in the background, lost in his own thoughts. The conversation turns to possible routes, and Randall brings up the idea of sailing to Alaska. Cindy and Stan immediately dismiss it. None of them know how to sail, and a boat would make them easy targets from the shore. Brett then asks why they're avoiding Canada altogether, and Stan explains that when the outbreak began, the military sealed the border, but they were too late. The entire army stationed there got infected, leaving the area overrun by the Crost. Brett scoffs at the idea, but before his attitude leads to an argument, Cindy redirects the group's focus to finding a safer plan. She warns them to stay away from the coast and major cities, since those areas will trap them, limiting their escape routes and increasing the chance of running into Crost. A silence follows as no one has a good alternative. Then Jeff suggests cutting through the desert, heading northwest across Utah and Nevada. The open space and harsh conditions would make it difficult for the Crost to survive. Brett, always eager to complain, loudly protests the idea. He rants about how brutal the desert will be, but Stan cuts him off, asking if he has a better plan. The conversation quickly turns into an argument. Stan calls Brett a whiny coward, while Brett reminds the group how much food and water he shared with them. Their voices rise, threatening to wake Patrick, but Kelly gently soothes the sleeping boy. The argument escalates until they're about to start swinging at each other when Cindy, unimpressed, simply says, "You two are boring me." Her words shut them both up. Cindy then states that Jeff's plan is their best option. As long as they plan their supplies carefully, especially water, they should be able to make it through. Stan mentions water purification tablets that can help make dirty water drinkable. Brett immediately starts complaining again, refusing to believe that's a good enough solution. Stan has had enough. He's ready to snap. But before he does, Cindy reminds him that he's supposed to relieve Thomas for lookout duty. Without another word, Stan walks away. Brett smirks, unaware that Cindy might have just saved his life. Stan finds Thomas and takes over his shift. As he settles in, Thomas casually mentions that the dog has come back again. Apparently, an uninfected stray has been hanging around, growing attached to them. Stan has always liked dogs but tries to ignore it, not wanting to get too attached. But as soon as he looks into its big, hopeful eyes, he gives in. Before long, the dog is sitting beside him, loyally keeping him company. However, Stan's happiness is short-lived. As the group moves closer to the desert, Brett takes over lookout duty. Cindy and Stan argue in the background. Cindy isn't happy about the dog. She tells Stan that any food it eats will come out of his own rations. More importantly, if the dog makes noise at the wrong time, Stan has to be ready to shoot it. Without hesitation, Stan agrees. This is the first time Cindy has seen him be so sure about something. They all sit quietly for a while until Patrick breaks the silence, asking what the dog's name is. The group smiles as they try to come up with one. Despite everything, Stan is happy. He never had a pet before, and even in this apocalyptic world, he's glad he found one now. As they talk, Stan asks Jeff why he never had friends. Jeff hesitates, then asks if he can be honest. Stan nods, and Jeff begins to open up. He grew up in a small town where being different meant getting bullied unless you blended in. Thomas, being a gay man, understands exactly what Jeff means. But then Jeff admits something shocking. He used to pick up young men and take them home, not for companionship, but to torture and kill them. He would bury their remains under his house. Everyone in the group freezes in horror. Thomas, who had just been comforting Jeff moments ago, turns away in disgust. Cindy instinctively moves Patrick behind her, shielding him. Jeff, not realizing the impact of his words, continues his story. The night the Crost outbreak began, he had a young man tied up, ready to be tortured. But before he could do anything, the man turned, infected. Instead of begging for mercy, he screamed at Jeff to get on with it, eager for pain. Terrified, Jeff fled, leaving the Crost man tied up in his basement. By now, Jeff is too ashamed to look up at the group, which is just as well. Most of them have forced themselves to keep a straight face. Thomas turns away, sickened. Cindy pulls Patrick even farther back. Finally, Jeff looks up and sees their reactions. He panics, desperate to make them understand. He swears he would never hurt any of them. They're his friends. But no one responds. The only sound is Cindy whispering a prayer. The only one who moves is Kittrick. As Jeff breaks down, weeping, Kittrick walks over and embraces him. The group watches, silent. Cindy exchanges a knowing look with Kittrick. The next morning, Jeff and Kittrick leave for a walk. Only Kittrick returns. No one asks what happened. 5 days later, they reach the edge of the desert and begin their grueling journey forward. The comic Mommy's Little Boy opens with a full-page panel showing the returning villain, H-Cock, and his crew. Among them is the Stump, a terrifying figure. This scene proves a theory. The Cross might be evolving. The entire crew is singing a song in unison. We could have been anything we wanted to be, with all the talent we had, no doubt about it. We fight and we shout it. We're the very best at being bad guys. As they sing, the Stump growls and screams, struggling to match their rhythm. The setting is a vast desert. Meanwhile, Stan and Cindy are scouting the area when they spot the crew. They are horrified. They had left this same crew, H-Cock's gang, behind 2 months ago, nearly 1,000 miles away, across a bridge. That was the same day they lost Sheena. Stan can't believe it. Cindy is just as shocked. How did the crew find them? Could they have been tracking them all this time? Cindy's face fills with fear. If these men can follow them through such harsh conditions, then they are in serious danger. Back at camp, the rest of the group is hiding out in an abandoned gas station. Stan and Cindy rush inside, yelling for everyone to pack up and leave. Some members hesitate, thinking they should stay and gather more supplies, but they can't take the risk. That's when they notice something. Someone left the generator running. A mistake like this could act as a beacon, leading the Crost straight to them. Brett quickly runs to turn off the generator, while Thomas, Kelly, Cindy, Stan, and Kittrick stand guard outside. They sync their radios, preparing to move. Despite wanting to avoid the roads, they have no other choice now. Stan questions why Cindy insists on taking the road. It will take longer. Cindy explains that traveling on the road will make it harder for the enemy to track them. The group is still puzzled. How did the Crost follow them across such a long distance? The world has changed since the apocalypse began, and nothing seems impossible anymore. They continue down the road until nightfall. Cindy suddenly checks behind them and freezes. There are lights in the distance. She quickly signals to Stan, making him stop and look as well. The entire group tenses up in the darkness. Stan and Cindy try to figure out what the light is. Then they realize it's the gas station they just left. It's engulfed in flames. Stan assumes that the Crost set it on fire just for their own amusement. But Cindy is starting to see a pattern. If this gang is smart enough to track them across the desert, they might be using the fire's glow to improve their chances of spotting the group's movements. Patrick has been uneasy this whole time, sensing danger. The only thing keeping him calm is Stan's dog, who has been a source of comfort through these terrifying days. The next panel shows the gas station where Horsecock's crew, though smarter and more restrained than before, still give in to their primal urges. They chain up one of their own and throw him into the fire to roast, part of their nightly ritual. After the man is cooked, they pull him out with a hot chain. But suddenly, Stump sniffs the air and lets out a loud, high-pitched shriek, a sound that had warned the group back on the bridge when they lost Sheena. The others, recognizing the danger, know they've been spotted. For the next 2 days, the group pushes themselves beyond their limits, only getting a couple hours of sleep each day. They cover a vast distance, but despite exhausting their water, they show no signs of weakening. Brett remains the same jerk, pestering Kelly about her blindness, wondering if she has developed superhuman hearing like Stump. Thomas snaps at Brett after Kelly shuts him down, but Brett continues, speculating that if Stump's powers are true, they may soon be caught by Horsecock's crew. For once, Cindy agrees with Brett. She reminds them that Stump would only track them if he suspected an uninfected person nearby. Their true pursuers are likely a trained tracker from Horsecock's crew. The group is now only 5 miles from a river where they can replenish their water. Things seem to be looking up, but Brett mocks Stan's earlier insult by Horsecock, calling him a fool. Before Stan can respond, Brett walks off, and Cindy catches up, reminding him of how he used to torment Joel in the past. After an hour or so, they reach the river, with Brett ahead, scouting. Thomas wonders if Stump's heightened senses came from the brutal way they cut off his limbs. It's just a theory, though. Stan radios Brett, asking if he sees any danger. Brett sarcastically replies that he would have warned them if something was wrong. Just as Stan is about to lash out, Brett screams from a hilltop. He spotted Horsecock's crew only a few meters away. Brett failed in his job to scout, and now they're under attack. Arrows, sharp sticks, and bullets rain down on them. Everyone dives for cover, but many stumble and fall into the river. A bullet hits Kittrick in the shoulder, and Cindy loses her grip on Patrick, the child swept away by the current. She frantically tries to save him, but is unable to reach him. Stan opens fire, yelling for Cindy to make it to the bank and pursue Patrick. Cindy, consumed with rage, shoots back at the attacking crew. The rest of the group makes it to the bank and provides cover fire, while Thomas orders Stan and Cindy to get out of the water and regroup. Despite his injury, Kittrick is still firing at the enemy. The group regathers, but before they can rest, Cindy runs after her son along the riverbank. Stan follows her. They scout the area for signs of Patrick. Cindy knows her son's survival skills well. She's taught him how to find safe spots in the river and wait for help. The rest of the group catches up, and Thomas patches up Kittrick while Brett whines about his near-death experience. Thomas realizes that Horsecock's crew is learning from their mistakes. They won't chase them across the river, knowing they'll be shot, but they may attack at night. Brett, nowhere to be found during the attack, emerges, crying about how he almost died. He pleads for the group to leave Patrick behind. Stan screams at him to shut up and leave if he's scared. The radio crackles again, and it's Horsecock's voice. He taunts them, saying they have Patrick. Stan realizes that Horsecock must have his radio, the one he dropped during the fight. Cindy rushes toward the radio, her face contorted with fury as Horsecock gives graphic details of what he's done to Patrick and how he plans to kill him. Horsecock laughs at their pain. Cindy runs, but Kittrick snatches the radio from her and demands proof that Patrick is still alive. After a few tense minutes, Horsecock admits that they've killed Patrick. Kittrick, seeing through the bluff, threatens to kill them all if they ever cross paths again. Cindy's heart breaks, but she knows they've been lied to. She's ready to leave immediately, but then chaos erupts. Brett screams in terror as he spots more of the Crost crossing the river toward them. Kittrick, done with running, grabs his pistol and demands they fight back. Before he can even move, Cindy is already sprinting down the hill. Stan, Thomas, and the rest follow. Stan reflects that this is the release they've all been waiting for, a chance to unleash their anger and frustration. Brett, terrified, follows the group. Soon, they confront Horsecock's crew. They open fire before the enemy can react, taking them down swiftly. Cindy spots Patrick in the distance and calls his name. She rushes to him, but when he turns, it's too late. He's been infected, a Crost now, with the mark on his face. He curses at his mother. Without hesitation, Cindy shoots him in the head, her expression cold and composed, not letting a single tear fall. Stan, horrified, cries out in disbelief, watching the boy he knew be killed by his own mother. The group stands in silence. Thomas and Kelly, visibly shaken, ask what happened, but neither Stan nor Kittrick can bring themselves to answer. Stan simply looks at Patrick's lifeless body, and that's all anyone needs to understand. What else can we do in such situation? It's a point of no return or hesitation, and not to hold back emotions as necessary actions have to be taken while without any regrets. Kelly is desperate for answers, but Stan urges the group to move on immediately. Brett, confused, wonders if Cindy will want to bury Patrick. Stan tells him that Cindy wouldn't even want to look at his body. The radio crackles again, and it's Horsecock, laughing maniacally. Frustrated, Thomas smashes the radio. Stan looks up, seeing Cindy walking alone ahead of them, into the desert. She doesn't look back. Now, he, his dog, and Cindy were going their separate way from the rest of the group. The group had been walking for days without much interaction, especially Cindy. Since the incident, she had been walking several feet ahead of everyone, keeping to herself. The others, including Stan, Brett, and Kelly, didn't talk much either. Thomas, feeling anxious, blurted out that at least they wouldn't have to hold back their swearing anymore since Patrick was gone. This comment made everyone freeze, and a wave of fear swept over them. Stan gave Thomas a disgusted look as he hurried to apologize. He didn't say anything, but as he looked ahead, he saw that Cindy had stopped too. She had heard what Thomas said. Trying to lighten the mood, Kelly quickly changed the subject and started talking about whether Horsecock and his crew were still tracking them. Brett whined, thinking that after the mind games they'd witnessed at the river, anything could be possible now. The rain had been pouring heavily, and they soon reached another river that they needed to cross. The water was rising quickly, and they knew they couldn't afford to take the long way around. But crossing the river meant they could break a bone, and staying out in the rain could mean pneumonia. They decided to look for shelter, and soon they found a crashed helicopter. Without hesitating, Cindy climbed inside and took the pilot's seat, quickly falling asleep. The rest of the group gathered in the cabin. It was an Army helicopter, and there was one other passenger aboard, a dead soldier's body. Kelly asked about Cindy, and Stan told her that Cindy hadn't eaten or changed her clothes since the incident. Whenever anyone tried to get close to her, she shot them a death glare so intense that they had stopped trying. Meanwhile, Brett found some old rifles in the helicopter, a little rusty, but he thought he could fix them. As he admired his new find, he didn't notice that he was pointing one of the rifles at Stan. Stan quickly and expertly moved the gun away from him. Then, Stan's dog started sniffing Brett, but Brett pushed it away with disgust. This led to another argument between Brett and Stan. Brett claimed that at least he was trying to help by staying positive, unlike the others who just sat around moping all day. Stan retorted that it was easy for Brett because he only cared about himself. Then Brett crossed the line, saying Stan was only pretending to be sad because he wouldn't be able to get close to Cindy anymore. Stan was shocked, and the artist used a black background to show the tension building inside him. The same background was used for the scene as Stan stood up suddenly and shoved Brett. But before things could escalate further, KCK intervened and told Brett to lower the gun. The gun had a grenade launcher attached to it, and if Brett wasn't careful, he could blow them all up. The tension died down after that, and over the next hour, Thomas kept lookout while the others went to sleep. Stan rummaged through the helicopter for anything useful and found a Bible in the dead soldier's pocket. He didn't like Bibles, but when he opened it, he found that it was filled with handwritten notes, like a diary. It was the diary of Captain Michael Alexander Juno of the U.S. Army. As the others slept, Stan read through the captain's journal. He learned a lot about the Army's actions when the C-virus outbreak happened. The captain's unit had been assigned to escort a group of scientists across the country to disable nuclear reactors and warheads. The captain hated the job because the scientists bickered constantly about how to approach each task without considering the dangers around them. Despite the challenges, the captain's crew managed to complete their mission. Afterward, the captain recalled how each base they visited seemed short on soldiers, and how every department head seemed to be losing faith. The mention of a classified mission made everyone uneasy. The captain wasn't happy with his next orders either. He was told to kill the scientists. The Army feared that if any of the scientists turned into Crost humans, they would retain their knowledge and could undo the work they had done on the nuclear facilities. The captain and his crew were ordered to kill each of them. The captain's crew had been following orders without question, but now that their mission was over, they started to think for themselves. However, just as the captain was about to take charge and lead them, a devastating storm hit, and their helicopter was badly damaged. They barely managed to land safely, but the flight chief died, and the captain broke both his legs. His crew wanted to carry him, but he refused, telling them to leave without him. It was an emotional farewell, but they had to go. The captain allowed them to take all the supplies they needed for their journey. He knew he was going to die, and didn't want them to waste anything on him. In his last moments, the captain hoped that what they had done for the country, killing the scientists, was worth it. His final entry in the diary was a reflection on his country, his family, and whether he had been a good man and a great soldier. By the time Stan finished reading, his eyes were filled with tears. By evening, the storm had calmed, and the group left the security of the helicopter, heading northwest. For an entire week, Stan kept a close watch on Cindy, who hadn't eaten a single bite of food. Her body had been running purely on adrenaline. During this time, she didn't sleep with them, nor did she talk to anyone. Stan knew that if this continued, he'd lose her. But by now, the rest of the group had grown increasingly indifferent with each passing moment. Cindy, too, had started to change. Her clothes were now ragged, and her hair, once neatly tied up, was a mess. Everything fell apart again once they set up camp for the night. They were running low on food, and while Brett greedily ate his share, Cindy sat alone on a hill 50 to 80 yards away. Meanwhile, Thomas was keeping an eye on Cindy's condition. Suddenly, Stan's dog tried to sniff at Brett, hoping for some scraps, but the jerk kicked the dog in the stomach. Thomas and Kelly yelled at him, trying to explain that the dog was just hungry like the rest of them, but it seemed impossible to reason with Brett. Stan, coldly observing, told Brett to stop kicking the dog. Brett just went back to reading the captain's journal, unfazed. He continued defending his actions, claiming the food was his and his alone. This sparked an argument between him, Kelly, and Thomas. Taking advantage of the distraction, Stan's dog lunged for the food, but Brett kicked him even harder this time. The dog yelped in pain as he was shoved aside. Stan, now putting his book down, warned Brett more firmly to stop kicking the dog. Brett, fed up, merely raised his middle finger at Stan, all while continuing to devour his food. Then, without any warning, bang! A bullet hit Brett straight in the chest. It was Stan who had shot him, doing so without flinching or a hint of remorse in his eyes. No one reacted, except for Kelly, who began to scream. Thomas tried to calm her down while Kittrick, watching from a distance, understood all too well that this had been inevitable. For the first time in weeks, Cindy looked at Stan, who now slumped his shoulders and began walking away from the group. Just like her, he was distancing himself. With Brett gone, they now had his supplies and continued traveling for 2 more days in silence. No one, not even Kelly or Thomas, attempted to speak to one another. After these 2 days, Stan finally approached Cindy with a heavy heart. She didn't say anything, nor did she give him a look of death. Instead, Stan, speaking softly, told her she needed to go back and bury Patrick. That's when her death stare returned. But Stan, too, was near the edge. He spoke again, explaining that she needed closure for herself. He promised to accompany her, urging her to see the importance of it. He reassured her that he had no ulterior motives, only trying his best to be the good guy after everything he had done, just like the captain. Then he showed her the journal he found. They talked about the children they had killed, how Cindy didn't need to stop and help them back when she had the chance, how she had to make hard choices. Stan implored her to find peace, to preserve whatever good was still left in her. There was a long silence before Cindy finally spoke. She asked Stan for some time to think over everything he had just told her. Stan, knowing he had struck a chord, left her alone without saying another word. The following day, Stan handed out a list of 5 locations that the rest of the group would be passing through in the upcoming weeks. He asked them to wait for him and Cindy at each location, assuring them they would catch up soon. Thomas didn't protest. In fact, he told Stan he was doing the right thing, and that they all owed their lives to Cindy. This was the least they could do for her. Stan shook hands with everyone as he parted ways. He reflected on how he would have loved to stay with these people, these friends. But that dream belonged to another life. After saying goodbye to Patrick, Stan and Cindy walked for miles and reached a desert. This time, Stan was leading the way. When he saw Patrick's body, he stopped and held his hand up for Cindy to halt. He walked down to the shore where he and the others had been shot at. He carefully wrapped Patrick's body in a blanket so Cindy wouldn't have to see how badly he was hurt. Once Patrick was covered from head to toe, Stan handed him over to Cindy and quietly told her that the ridge nearby would be a good spot for Patrick's grave. Cindy, holding back tears, agreed and took Patrick's body. Stan kept watch for any danger while Cindy said her final goodbyes to Patrick and buried him. After she finished, the dam holding back her tears finally broke, and she cried without holding back. Stan didn't move and let her have this moment of grief. It could have been minutes or hours. Stan didn't know. But when Cindy was done, she came up to him from behind and said, "There's nothing special about me." Cindy was referring to the times Stan had called her special for saving his life, saving their lives, being a great mother to Patrick, and being the best survivalist Stan had ever met. Cindy didn't look special at all now. She was bruised, dirty, her clothes were torn, and her hair was messy. But Stan's eyes told her he didn't believe that at all. As she washed herself in the river, Cindy opened up to Stan. She told him that her grandfather had taught her to use guns because he believed women should be able to protect themselves. She explained how she had married a terrible man because she was young and naive. Her husband had beaten her until she couldn't take it anymore, and she had to stand up for herself. After that, she ran from town to town with Patrick. Her life had forced her to learn to be disciplined and never to get too comfortable. She felt like that was all she was. "I'm not special," she said. Stan didn't say anything, and after Cindy finished cleaning up, they continued on their journey, pushing hard to catch up with the rest of the group. That night, they rested in an old church at the edge of a town. Stan looked up in shock at the statue of Jesus Christ, where he saw a decaying body hanging in the same position as Christ. Once he was done looking, they ate the little food they had left. Stan asked Cindy how she felt. She didn't know, but she thanked him for pushing her to do what was right. Stan said it was the least he could do. Cindy then admitted that she felt like everything she did was pointless. She had done everything to keep Patrick safe, but now it felt like it had all been a waste. She remembered the time when they had both killed the children. At the time, it felt like the right thing to do. But now that they had done it, where did that leave them? What did that make them? Stan took a long pause before replying. He reminded her that everything they did was for survival, not just for them, but for everyone they were traveling with. Some people had died, and it might have seemed like their efforts were wasted, but it wasn't all for nothing. It was all done to survive. They sat in silence as Cindy thought over his words. Then Cindy looked at the body, hanging from the statue of Christ, and suggested they remove it before leaving. Stan agreed, and the two of them sat there, eating their food in quiet silence. As we are in the last issue of this story, thank you for watching, and do like and subscribe if you like our content. As we continue on the other side of the country, Thomas and Kelly walk ahead while Kittrick struggles behind. They've passed two spots where they were supposed to meet Cindy and Stan, but there's no sign of them. Kelly still hopes they'll find them at the third location, but Thomas is getting nervous. He's not comfortable making decisions for the group, especially not like Cindy and Stan used to do. The three of them talk for a while, and then Kittrick suddenly says they're being followed by Horsecock's crew. It's too late to turn back. Thomas is shocked, but Kittrick tells them to keep walking like they haven't noticed anything. It's their only advantage. Kittrick saw some of Horsecock's men trying to surround them, and if it were anyone else, they'd have been ambushed by now. He then asks Thomas and Kelly to leave him behind, but tells them not to run until the shooting starts. Kittrick plans to distract the attackers and take out as many as he can. Kelly and Thomas try to protest, but Kittrick says he's ready to die and meet his wife and kids in heaven. Without waiting for their reply, he turns around and starts walking in the opposite direction. Kittrick drops to his knees and pretends that the group has left him, but behind his back, he holds his pistol and thinks about his family while waiting for the attack. Soon enough, Horsecock and his crew come out from behind the trees, ready to kill Kittrick. But then Stump, one of the crew members, lets out a loud cry as if he's picked up a scent or heard something. The whole group stops in their tracks, and they decide to attack Kittrick from a distance. They start shooting at him. Kittrick curses and shoots back, managing to hit a few of them, but there are too many armed with automatic rifles. Cindy and Stan hear the gunfire from a distance. They realize it's coming from Kittrick and quickly rush toward the sound, thinking it's Thomas and the others. Meanwhile, Kittrick is badly wounded, lying on the ground but still refusing to give up. He keeps shooting until he faces the old man, Face, who's carrying Stump on his back. Kittrick tries to shoot him, but Face slices his arm off with a machete. Then Face tries to assault Kittrick, but Horsecock stops him, ordering his crew to kill only Kittrick. Face gets furious, screaming at Horsecock, but Horsecock hits him repeatedly. He doesn't stop until Face's face is completely destroyed. Then, Horsecock picks up Stump and puts him on his back, telling the crew to go after the others. Meanwhile, Thomas and Kelly are running, trying to push Kittrick's death from their minds. Cindy and Stan are also rushing through the forest, hoping to find their friends. Thomas and Kelly moved swiftly through the forest, hearts pounding, their minds racing with the fate of Kittrick. As they pushed forward, their steps growing more frantic, they heard a rustling sound from behind them. Instantly, they dove behind a fallen tree, their breaths shallow as they waited. A few moments later, a figure from Horsecock's crew appeared, searching the area for any sign of them. They remained perfectly still, praying the figure wouldn't spot them. After what felt like an eternity, the figure finally moved on, and they waited for an hour, as they had done countless times before, to make sure the danger had passed. Once they felt safe enough to continue, they began walking along a cliffside. As they moved, Thomas tried to steady his thoughts, giving Kelly one last bit of advice in case the worst happened. He explained that the cliff was only about 10 yards from the tree line on their right, and she should remember it if she needed to act quickly. Together they tried to figure out their next steps, but options were slim. There was no clear way out of the forest, and every path seemed to lead to another deadly encounter with Horsecock's crew. Meanwhile, Stan and Cindy were not far behind. They were racing through the same forest, scanning the terrain for any sign of their friends. But then, the worst possible scenario unfolded. Horsecock's crew jumped out of the shadows, ambushing Stan and Cindy. Before they could react, Horsecock struck Thomas across the face with his weapon, knocking his gun from his hands and sending his glasses flying. The chaos intensified as Horsecock began torturing Kelly while the rest of the crew looked on. Thomas, struggling to regain his bearings, searched frantically for his glasses, but before he could find them, something in him snapped. With a desperate, feral roar, Thomas lunged at Horsecock, sinking his teeth deep into the side of Horsecock's neck. His crew watched in shock as their leader bled out, collapsing and crushing Stump beneath him. Kelly, stunned, managed to spot Thomas's gun on the ground. She grabbed it just in time as Thomas, bloodied and gasping for air, finally managed to push Horsecock's body off Stump. In a flash, Kelly shot both Horsecock and Stump in the head, ending their lives before they could recover. With the immediate threat gone, Thomas, knowing his time was running out, urged Kelly to flee. Tears filled her eyes as she clutched his hand. She couldn't bear to leave him, but Thomas insisted it was the only way. He could feel the life slipping from his body, and he knew the crew would be upon them soon. Their tearful farewell ended in a single, tragic choice. They jumped off the cliff together, embracing their fate. On the other side of the valley, Stan and Cindy had reached the ridge, watching the scene unfold through binoculars. The devastation of seeing their friends' deaths unfold before them left them both paralyzed. Stan sat on a rock, staring into the distance, lost in thought. Cindy, however, was filled with a burning resolve. If they couldn't save their friends, they could at least end Horsecock's reign of terror. She was determined to eliminate every last one of his crew. After discussing their plan, Stan reluctantly agreed. The two of them spent the next day stalking the remaining crew, waiting for the right moment to strike. The opportunity came when they spotted a man attempting to organize the scattered remnants of Horsecock's crew. Cindy's focus sharpened as she prepared to take him down first. With precise shots, Stan and Cindy systematically eliminated each of Horsecock's remaining crew members, one by one. Even when they attempted to charge, they were cut down before they could get within reach. Cindy stood tall and unyielding as she took the final shot, ending the last of Horsecock's crew. The wind whispered through the tall grass, and the distant hills seemed to bring a strange sense of peace. The man who had tried to organize the crew was still alive, but only barely. As he cried out in a futile attempt to make sense of his impending doom, Stan ended his suffering with a final, merciless shot to the head. With the crew wiped out, Cindy and Stan traveled in silence for several days. They had accomplished what they set out to do, but the toll it had taken on them was heavy. When they reached the northern edge of the wilderness, Alaska's icy borders seemed like a welcome shield from the world they had left behind. The journey had been long, and they had survived the worst of it, but the scars, both physical and emotional, ran deep. Stan stared ahead, his face set with determination, his mind quietly wrestling with the decisions he had made. He didn't know if it had been worth it, but he couldn't afford to second-guess himself now. All around him, the world felt eerily still, but Cindy's gaze on him didn't escape his notice. She looked at him the way he had looked at her all this time, softly, with a tenderness he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge. Stan, oblivious to her gaze, continued his descent toward the snow-capped white mountains. But as their figures grew smaller in the distance, Cindy took his hand. Her grip was firm and steady, and though they didn't speak, the simple act of holding hands spoke volumes. The final panel of the comic showed the two of them walking together into the sunset, their hands entwined as they faced the unknown future ahead.